And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again, this low pressure area, pretty large low out here, slowly drifting eastward, slowly weakening, but enough of a gradient on the backside of that system for winds gusting to 50 miles an hour this evening, with gale warnings out here for the central Aleutian, slowly diminishing, especially after midnight. Weak front keeps it cloudy, mild, with areas of mixed precipitation across southern Alaska in the form of rain, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, Kenai Peninsula, North Gulf Coast. And again, stays wet over the panhandle, drier in the interior. And for tomorrow, about the same pattern, except this action down here is a lot weaker, more scattered in nature as far as the precipitation goes, but still occasionally wet for the North Gulf Coast, Kenai Peninsula, down across the panhandle. And this slow drifting continues to drift eastward and weaken. Winds really diminish out here as higher pressure builds into the central Aleutians. That ahead of a big storm coming into the western Bering Sea that pushes another round of possible storm force winds, definitely gales, in toward the central Aleutians Saturday afternoon. And then remnants of this system here keeps it unsettled from the Kenai Peninsula, Bristol Bay, and the southwest coast. Scattered areas of light precipitation, mostly in the form of snow over the interior here, drying out south central Alaska. Mostly dry day, at least in part, for Kodiak Island, and some light rain with this warm front for the northern panhandle up to about Yakutat. And for coastal water forecast, south winds 20 knots there for the south coast of the panhandle, southeast 20 knots for the north coast, and south 15, Lynn Canal Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage. Southeast winds 20 to 40 knots, southeast 15 for Clarence Strait with 7-foot seas. And then for Saturday, all the inside waters here, looking at southeast winds at 10 knots with slight seas. And Prince of Wales Island coast, west coast, south winds 10 knots, seas 11 feet. And the central coast here, southeast winds at 15 knots, and the north coast, east winds at 20 knots. Prince William Sound, east winds 30 knots tomorrow. Pretty brisk day there with seas up to 6 feet. South to southeast winds 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Kamishak Bay, southeast winds at 20 knots. Northeast winds 20 knots for Cook Inlet, and small craft advisories for the Barren Islands. South winds 25 knots, seas just under 10 feet. And then for the day on Saturday, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots for Cook Inlet with 3 to 4 foot seas. Southeast winds 25 knots, Kamishak Bay, and about 20 knots there for the Barren Islands. East winds now down to 20 knots for Prince William Sound, with those seas subsiding to 4 feet. Small craft advisories continue for the eastern North Gulf Coast for east winds 25 to 30 knots, seas 8 feet. Kodiak Island, south to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots for Friday. Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, southeast winds 25 knots, seas 3 feet. And for Saturday, Bristol Bay, southeast winds at 20 there, and southwest 25 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Kodiak Island, east-southeast 15 to 20 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, anywhere from east to northwest winds, 20 to 25 knots there. And let's see, Adak and Atka, northwest winds 30 knots, same thing for Mchitka Island. And then gales in the afternoon, southwest 40 knots from Kiska Island to Shimia. And then those full gales here extend eastward, so we've got 45 knot winds for the entire Aleutian chain in the forecast, the exception being Unalaska Island. And mostly west-southwest 45 knots there west of Adak, south to southwest for the direction here for Adak and Atka, and then south to southwest for the eastern Aleutians. For the southwest coast, for Friday, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Northeast winds 15 to 20 knots for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. Pribilofs, northeast 25 knots, seas 8 feet. St. Matthew Island, northeast winds at 20. And for Saturday, Pribilof Island, southeast winds 40 knots, seas 11 feet. Southeast winds 45 knots for St. Matthew Island. Otherwise, Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, all out of the east at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. And south of Nunivak Island, winds will be southeast at 30 knots. For the Chukchi Sea on Friday, east to southeast winds 10 to 20 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the western Arctic coast here for east winds at 25 knots. And then the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast looking at east winds at 20 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Saturday, east and south winds at 15 knots, and for the central and western Arctic coast, southeast winds 15 knots. And small craft advisories for the Chukchi Sea for east to southeast winds at 25 knots, with seas running around 5 feet.